Private Jake Carter stepped off the bus onto the dusty grounds of Fort Braxton, his boots kicking up little clouds of dirt as he walked. The military base was huge, with tall fences, rows of barracks, and soldiers marching everywhere. Jake smirked, adjusting his cap. He thought he was the toughest guy here, and he couldn't wait to prove it. Jake was the kind of guy who never missed a chance to crack a joke, especially if it made others laugh or if it made someone else look bad. He liked being the center of attention, and if that meant poking fun at others, so be it. As he lined up with the other new recruits, he nudged the guy next to him. "Man, this place looks like it hasn't been updated since the Stone Age," Jake said, grinning. The other recruit chuckled nervously, but Jake didn't care. He was already scanning the crowd, looking for someone to entertain himself with. That's when he saw her. Standing a few feet away was a black woman, her posture straight, her arms crossed. She wasn't talking to anyone, just watching everything with sharp, focused eyes. But what really caught Jake's attention were the scars running down her arms, thick, jagged lines that looked like they had been there for years. "Whoa," Jake whispered to his new buddy. Asterisk, check out Scarface over there. Bet she got those in a cat fight. Asterisk. The guy next to him snorted, but a few others just glanced at the woman nervously. She didn't react. She didn't even look at Jake. She just kept staring ahead, like she was used to ignoring idiots like him. A drill sergeant suddenly barked orders, and the recruits scrambled into formation. Jake fell in line, still smirking, still thinking he was the funniest guy around. He had no idea who that woman really was. No idea that those scars told a story way bigger than any joke he could make. But he was about to find out. The first day of training was brutal running, push-ups, more running. Jake's muscles burned, but he refused to show weakness. Instead, he kept cracking jokes, especially when he saw the scarred woman outperforming everyone. She didn't struggle. She didn't complain. She just did it like it was nothing. Asterisk, what's her deal? Asterisk, Jake muttered to another recruit during a water break. Asterisk, she act like she's better than us or something? Asterisk. The recruit just shook his head. Asterisk, man, I don't know, but I ain't messing with her. She looks like she could break us in half. Asterisk. Jake laughed. Asterisk, yeah right. She's probably just some washed-up soldier who got hurt and got stuck babysitting newbies. Asterisk. Little did Jake know he was dead wrong. As the sun set on his first day at Fort Braxton, Jake Carter was still just a loudmouthed recruit with a lot to learn. And the woman with the scars? She was way more than she seemed. But that was a lesson he'd have to learn the hard way. The sun rose over Fort Braxton, painting the training fields in golden light as another grueling day began. Private Jake Carter groaned as he rolled out of his bunk, muscles still sore from yesterday's drills. But his tiredness didn't stop his mouth from running. As recruits shuffled toward the mess hall for breakfast, Jake spotted her again, the woman with the scars. She moved differently than the others, every step precise, every glance intentional. While most recruits dragged their feet in exhaustion, she walked like someone who had somewhere important to be. Jake elbowed his new friend, Private Rodriguez. "Look alive, Rodriguez," he snickered. "Scarface is already up and at him. Bet she sleeps standing at attention." A few nearby recruits chuckled nervously. The woman didn't even glance their way. She just kept walking, collecting her breakfast with quiet efficiency. Training that morning was brutal. Sergeant Mackey had them running obstacle courses under the blazing sun. Jake was panting, sweat pouring down his face, when he noticed something incredible. The scarred woman wasn't just keeping up, she was leading. She scaled walls faster, crawled under wires smoother, and when it came to the rope climb, she practically flew up like it was nothing. During a water break, Jake leaned against a fence, gasping for air. "How's she doing that?" he wheezed to Rodriguez. Rodriguez wiped sweat from his brow. "Maybe she's done this before?" Jake snorted. "Yeah right. Probably just showing off." He raised his voice just enough to carry. "Some people think they're so special just because they've got fancy battle scars." The woman didn't react. She just took a long drink from her canteen, her eyes scanning the horizon, like she was watching for something none of them could see. That afternoon brought weapons training. As recruits lined up at the shooting range, Jake bragged about his hunting experience back home. But when the scarred woman stepped up to fire, something remarkable happened. Asterisk bam.
Bam.
Bam. Asterisk. Every shot hit dead center. Perfect grouping. The range instructor nodded approvingly. Nice shooting, Lieutenant. Jake's mouth fell open. Lieutenant? As the woman walked past, Jake couldn't resist one last jab. Guess you had practice shooting cats, huh, Scarface? For the first time, she paused. Just for a second. Then she turned those piercing eyes on Jake, and he suddenly felt very small. You ever wonder, she said quietly, why no one else laughs at your jokes? Then she walked away, leaving Jake standing there, his face burning hotter than the afternoon sun. That night in the barracks, the recruits whispered about the mysterious woman. My cousin was stationed here last year, Rodriguez said. He told me there's a soldier here called Viper. Some kind of special forces legend. Jake rolled his eyes.
Yeah, right.
And I'm the president. But as he lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Why did the instructors treat her differently? Why didn't she react to his teasing? And most importantly, why did he suddenly feel like the smallest person in the room whenever she looked at him? The answers were coming, and Jake Carter wasn't going to like them one bit. The third morning at Fort Braxton dawned with a thick fog rolling across the training fields, making everything look hazy and strange. Private Jake Carter stretched his aching muscles as he trudged toward the obstacle course with the other recruits. The past 2 days of relentless drills had left them all exhausted, but Jake still had enough energy to be his usual loudmouth self. As they waited for instructions, Jake noticed the scarred woman Lieutenant Colonel Dawson, as he'd recently learned inspecting the course with a critical eye. She moved along the obstacles, testing ropes and checking handholds like someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. Look at that, Jake whispered loudly to the group around him. Scarface is checking to make sure the playground is safe for us kids. A few recruits chuckled nervously, but more of them stayed quiet this time. Rodriguez actually took a small step away from Jake, like he didn't want to be associated with the comment. Jake opened his mouth to make another joke when suddenly Lieutenant Colonel Dawson turned and looked right at him. Not past him. Not through him.
Right at him.
Her dark eyes seemed to see everything about him, his arrogance, his insecurity, all of it. Jake felt his face grow hot, but he refused to back down. What? He said, louder than he meant to. You got something to say, Scarface? The entire group went silent. The air felt heavy, like before a thunderstorm. Even the birds seemed to stop chirping. Before Dawson could respond, a voice like rolling thunder split the morning air. What is the meaning of this? Every recruit snapped to attention as General Mitchell stormed toward them. The general wasn't just angry, he was furious. His face was red, his jaw clenched so tight Jake could see the muscles twitching. General Mitchell stopped directly in front of Jake, so close Jake could see the metals gleaming on his uniform. Private Carter, the general growled. Would you care to repeat what you just said? Jake's mouth went dry. His heart pounded so loud, he was sure everyone could hear it. It was just a joke, sir, he stammered. A joke. The general's voice was dangerously quiet. You think military decorum is a joke? You think disrespecting a superior officer is funny? Jake felt sweat trickle down his back despite the morning chill. Superior officer? I didn't know. The general turned sharply toward Lieutenant Colonel Dawson. Lieutenant Colonel Dawson, he said in a voice that carried across the entire field, would you care to explain to Private Carter why his behavior is unacceptable? All the blood drained from Jake's face. Lieutenant Colonel? This whole time, he'd been mocking someone who outranked him by, he wasn't even sure how many ranks. Dawson stepped forward, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. General, she said calmly, I believe Private Carter was commenting on my scars. Again. The general's eyes blazed. He turned back to Jake, and when he spoke, his voice shook with barely controlled rage. You ignorant little boy. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Any clue what those scars represent? Jake couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He just stood there, suddenly realizing he was in way over his head. The general looked at Dawson with something Jake had never seen in a superior officer's eyes before: respect. Deep, genuine respect. "Lieutenant Colonel Dawson," the general said, "perhaps it's time these recruits learned exactly who you are." Dawson gave the smallest of nods. And in that moment, Jake Carter realized with terrible certainty that he was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The other recruits stood frozen, their eyes wide.
No one made a sound.
Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting to hear what would come next. Because one thing was now perfectly clear to everyone: Jake had messed up. Big time. And whatever was coming next was going to change everything. A heavy silence fell over the training field as all eyes turned to Lieutenant Colonel Ava Dawson. The morning mist curled around her boots as she stood perfectly still, her scarred arms at her sides. For the first time since Jake had arrived at Fort Braxton, the woman he'd been calling Scarface was about to speak. And something in her posture suggested they should all listen very carefully. General Mitchell took a step back, giving Dawson space. His expression had changed from anger to something more complex, a mixture of pride and painful memory. The recruits held their breath. Even the trees seemed to stop rustling. Dawson didn't raise her voice when she finally spoke. 2 years ago, she began, her words clear and measured, "I was leading a special operations team in Afghanistan." Her eyes focused on some distant point beyond the recruits, like she was seeing it all over again. "We were ambushed. 12 against 30. Not good odds." Jake swallowed hard. His mouth had gone completely dry. "It happened fast," Dawson continued. "Rounds hitting all around us. My medic went down first, then my communications specialist, then my point man." She held up her scarred arms slightly, examining them as if seeing them for the first time. These came after." A bird cried somewhere in the distance, the sound sharp in the quiet morning air. "We were pinned down with no extraction possible," Dawson said. 3 of my soldiers were too wounded to move on their own. The enemy was closing in." She paused, and for just a second, Jake thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, not fear, but the memory of fear. "So, I did what any commander would do. I got my people out." The way she said it made it sound simple. But the scars told a different story. Dawson turned her arms slightly, showing the full extent of the damage. "Carried Martinez first. He took a round to the leg. Then Simmons, shrapnel in his back. Then Carter, yes, private, same last name as you, who had 2 bullets in his abdomen." She locked eyes with Jake. Each trip was about 200 yards, while taking fire. Jake felt something twist in his stomach. He suddenly couldn't look at her scars anymore. "When I got the last one to relative safety," Dawson continued, "I realized we were about to be overrun. So, I did the only thing left." She took a deep breath. "I called in an airstrike. On our own position." Rodriguez gasped audibly. Several other recruits exchanged shocked glances. "The explosion caught me at the edge of the blast radius," Dawson said, touching one particularly bad scar. "Third-degree burns over 15% of my body. But it worked. The enemy retreated. My team survived." She lowered her arms. "Medal ceremony was nice. The year of physical therapy wasn't." General Mitchell cleared his throat. Lieutenant Colonel Dawson was awarded the Silver Star for valor that day, the highest honor a soldier can receive, short of the Medal of Honor. The weight of what Jake had been mocking settled over him like a physical thing. These weren't just scars. They were medals made of flesh. Proof of sacrifices he couldn't even imagine. Dawson looked at each recruit in turn, finally resting her gaze on Jake. "You want to know why I don't react to your jokes, Private? Because what you think of me doesn't matter. What any of you think doesn't matter. The only opinion that counts is that of the soldiers I serve with. And they know exactly what these mean." She tapped her scars lightly. A long silence followed. Some of the recruits shuffled their feet. Others stared at the ground. Jake couldn't seem to make his mouth work at all. General Mitchell finally broke the quiet. "Training is dismissed for the morning. I expect all of you to report back after lunch with a new understanding of respect." He gave Jake a look that could have melted steel. "Especially you, Private." As the general and Lieutenant Colonel Dawson walked away, none of the recruits moved right away. The truth they'd just heard was too big, too heavy to process quickly. Jake stood frozen, his earlier arrogance replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: shame. Real, gut-wrenching shame. Because now he understood something important. The strongest people often don't need to prove it. And the bravest soldiers don't need to brag. Their scars tell the story for them. The moment Lieutenant Colonel Dawson finished speaking, a strange stillness settled over the training field. Jake Carter felt his knees wobble slightly, as if the ground beneath him had become unstable. His mouth hung open slightly, but no words came out. All the clever jokes and snide remarks that usually came so easily had evaporated like morning dew under the harsh sunlight of truth. General Mitchell's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Private Carter. Front and center. Every muscle in Jake's body tensed as he took 3 shaky steps forward. His uniform suddenly felt too tight, the collar rubbing against his throat like a noose. He could feel dozens of eyes boring into his back, his fellow recruits watching, waiting to see what would happen next. "Look at Lieutenant Colonel Dawson when you speak to her," the general ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Jake forced his head up. Meeting Dawson's eyes was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. Those dark eyes held no anger, no hatred, just a quiet disappointment that somehow hurt worse than any punishment could. I'm sorry, ma'am," Jake stammered. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, not because he didn't mean them, but because he knew how inadequate they were. "I didn't know. I wouldn't have." Dawson held up a hand, stopping his fumbling apology mid-sentence. "Private," she said calmly, "I don't need your apology." Jake blinked. This wasn't going how he expected. "What I need," Dawson continued, "is for you to understand something important." She turned slightly to address all the recruits gathered around them. "Every one of you came here to become soldiers. But being a soldier isn't just about following orders or shooting straight." She rolled up her sleeves slightly, revealing the full extent of her scars in the morning light. "It's about character. It's about respecting those who serve beside you, no matter what they look like or where they come from." A light breeze ruffled the grass at their feet as Dawson spoke. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing to listen. "These scars," she said, running a finger along one particularly jagged mark, "aren't something I'm ashamed of.
They're proof that I survived.
That my team survived. That the mission was completed." She looked directly at Jake again. "When you've been through real combat, Private, you learn that what matters isn't how tough you talk, but how you act when lives are on the line." General Mitchell nodded solemnly. Lieutenant Colonel Dawson could have retired after her injuries. Could have taken a desk job. Instead, she chose to come here to train the next generation of soldiers. He fixed Jake with a piercing stare. "That's the kind of dedication we expect from everyone at Fort Braxton." Jake's face burned with shame. All his bravado, all his loud jokes, they suddenly seemed so childish, so pointless. He'd been trying so hard to prove he was tough that he'd missed the most important lesson of all. Real toughness wasn't about putting others down. It was about lifting them up. Dawson took a step closer to Jake, close enough that he could see the tiny flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "You've got potential, Carter," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "But potential means nothing without discipline, without respect." For the first time since arriving at boot camp, Jake had nothing smart to say. No joke. No sarcastic comment. Just a hollow feeling in his chest where his arrogance used to be. The general dismissed the recruits for lunch, but no one moved immediately. The group stood in stunned silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. Rodriguez finally broke the spell by giving Jake's shoulder a sympathetic squeeze before walking away. As Jake trudged toward the mess hall, his appetite completely gone, he realized something profound. He'd been looking at everything backward this whole time. The scars he'd mocked weren't weaknesses at all. They were badges of honor. Proof of battles fought and survived. And Lieutenant Colonel Dawson? She wasn't just some soldier to make fun of. She was exactly the kind of warrior Jake had dreamed of becoming when he first enlisted. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd been acting like a bully when what he really wanted was to be a hero. As the midday sun beat down on his back, Jake Carter made a silent promise to himself. He was going to change.
Not because he had to.
But because now, finally, he understood what it truly meant to be a soldier. And that understanding started with one simple truth. Real strength doesn't tear people down. It builds them up. Just like Lieutenant Colonel Dawson had done for him today, without even realizing it. The days following Lieutenant Colonel Dawson's revelation passed in a blur of sweat, sore muscles, and silent reflection for Private Jake Carter. Where before he had dragged himself out of bed with groans and complaints, now he rose before dawn without prompting. The change in his behavior didn't happen overnight, but gradually, like the sun burning away morning fog. Gone was the loudmouth who cracked jokes at others' expense. In his place stood a soldier who listened more than he spoke, who watched more than he showed off. During morning drills, Jake no longer lagged behind, making wisecracks. Instead, he pushed himself to keep pace with the front-runners, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but his determination unwavering. One particularly grueling afternoon found the recruits running timed laps around the perimeter fence. Jake's lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead weights, but he kept pushing. As he rounded a corner, he spotted Lieutenant Colonel Dawson observing from the sidelines. Their eyes met briefly, and something unexpected happened. She gave him the smallest nod of acknowledgement. That tiny gesture fueled Jake more than any insult or challenge ever could. At the shooting range, where he'd once bragged about his non-existent marksmanship skills, Jake now sat quietly during instruction, absorbing every word. When it came time to fire, his hands still shook slightly, but his shots grouped tighter than before. The range instructor raised an eyebrow at the improvement, but said nothing. Jake didn't need praise. The satisfaction of doing better was reward enough. The mess hall became another place of transformation. Where Jake had once held court at his table, entertaining recruits with mocking impressions of their drill sergeants, he now ate in thoughtful silence. Occasionally, he'd even catch himself studying the other soldiers, really looking at them for the first time. The skinny kid from Iowa who could do more pull-ups than anyone. The quiet woman who could disassemble a rifle blindfolded. Each had strengths he'd been too self-absorbed to notice before. Rodriguez, who'd borne the brunt of Jake's early bullying, was the first to comment on the change. "What happened to you, man?" he asked one evening as they polished their boots. "You get replaced by a robot or something?" Jake smiled faintly, but didn't take the bait. "Just growing up, I guess." The real test came during hand-to-hand combat training. Jake found himself paired with a hulking recruit named Williams, who'd been on the receiving end of several of Jake's cruel jokes in the past. As they squared off, Jake could see the anticipation in Williams' eyes. This was his chance to pay back all those insults with interest. But when the instructor blew the whistle, Jake didn't try to show off or humiliate his opponent. He fought clean, using the techniques they'd been taught. When Williams eventually pinned him, Jake simply tapped out and said, "Good match." The surprise on Williams' face was almost comical. Lieutenant Colonel Dawson observed all this from the sidelines, her expression unreadable. She never gave Jake special treatment or easy passes. If anything, she seemed to hold him to a higher standard than before. When he messed up, she corrected him immediately. When he succeeded, she offered no empty praise, just a simple carry on. And that was exactly what Jake needed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the other recruits began treating Jake differently. Not with the nervous laughter of people humoring a bully, but with genuine respect. They started coming to him for help with drills, trusting his advice on maneuvers, even saving him a seat at meals. One evening, as Jake lay in his bunk studying the training manual, Rodriguez tossed him a candy bar. "Figured you could use the energy, brainiac," he joked. Jake caught it with one hand. "Thanks, man." Rodriguez hesitated, then added, "You're all right, Carter. You know that, right?" Jake didn't know how to respond. The truth was, he was just beginning to understand what all right really meant. It wasn't about being the loudest or the funniest or the toughest. It was about showing up, doing your best, and treating people with respect. As the lights-out bell rang, Jake lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about how far he'd come in such a short time. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time since arriving at Fort Braxton, he felt like he was actually becoming a soldier. Not the kind who makes others feel small to make himself feel big, but the kind who earns respect through actions, not words. The kind Lieutenant Colonel Dawson would be proud to serve beside. And that thought alone was enough to make all the pain and struggle worthwhile. The final training exercise arrived like a storm rolling across the Fort Braxton training grounds. 6 months had passed since Jake Carter's first humiliating day, 6 months of blistered feet, aching muscles, and slow, hard-earned growth. Now, under a sky-threatening rain, Jake and his squad stood at the edge of the most challenging simulation they'd faced, yet a full tactical assault course designed to test everything they'd learned. Sergeant Mackey's voice boomed across the field. "Listen up, maggots. This is your final exam before graduation. You'll navigate to the objective through enemy territory, retrieve the intelligence package, and extract without being captured. Fail, and you repeat basic training. Understood?" A chorus of "Yes, Sergeant" rang out. Jake adjusted his helmet, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He'd been named squad leader for this exercise, a position that would have terrified the old Jake, the one who cared more about jokes than results. The moment the starting whistle blew, Jake's squad moved out with precision they wouldn't have dreamed of months ago. Rodriguez took point, scanning for threats. Williams covered their rear. Jake kept them moving at a steady pace, checking their position on the map every few minutes. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. They avoided patrols, navigated obstacles, and even decoded their first set of coordinates. Then, as they approached what should have been a simple river crossing, disaster struck. "Ambush!" Rodriguez hissed as simulated gunfire erupted from the tree line. The squad hit the dirt. Jake's mind raced. The river was too wide to cross under fire. Going around would make them miss their extraction window. Staying put meant certain capture. Williams cursed. "We're pinned down. What's the play, Carter?" Jake opened his mouth to respond when movement caught his eye. Lieutenant Colonel Dawson stood partially concealed by foliage about 20 yards to their left. She didn't intervene, didn't give orders. She simply made eye contact with Jake and tapped her temple twice. Suddenly, Jake remembered something she'd said during a lecture weeks ago. "When you're stuck, look up. Solutions often come from unexpected angles." Jake's gaze shot upward. "The trees." "Of course." "Change of plan," Jake whispered urgently. "Rodriguez, Williams provide covering fire. The rest of us are going up and over." Using the dense network of branches, the squad moved above the enemy position undetected. Within minutes, they'd flanked the ambush team and neutralized them with well-placed simulation rounds. The final stretch to the extraction point passed in a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. When Jake's team finally secured the intelligence package and signaled for pickup, the look on Sergeant Mackey's face was priceless. "Damn it, Carter," the sergeant grumbled, though Jake thought he detected a hint of pride. "You weren't supposed to solve it that way." As the squad celebrated their success, Jake noticed Lieutenant Colonel Dawson approaching. His stomach tightened instinctively, but this time it wasn't from fear or shame. Dawson stopped in front of the group. "Not bad," she said simply. Then, just before turning away, she gave Jake something more valuable than any medal or ribbon, a firm nod of approval. In that moment, Jake Carter understood what it truly meant to be a soldier. Not the fake toughness he'd pretended to have on day one, but the real strength that came from discipline, teamwork, and perseverance. As the graduation ceremony approached, Jake stood a little taller in his freshly pressed uniform. The scars on his hands from months of training told their own story, not of battle wounds, but of growth. When his name was called to receive his certificate, Jake didn't strut or showboat like he might have months ago. He simply accepted it with quiet pride, then turned to salute the officers on stage. Lieutenant Colonel Dawson returned the salute, her expression as unreadable as ever. But Jake didn't need words to understand. The journey from arrogant recruit to disciplined soldier had been long and difficult, but every painful step had been worth it. Because now, finally, Jake Carter wasn't just playing soldier. He was one.
The end.